Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Kaf. We're going to start at the first line. We're in the middle of the topic of Pasei Biraot. I just went away down south yesterday, and of course, what did I come upon? We went to the Gan Le'umi Uvda, and there's a Nabatean city from the times of the basically pre-Mishnah time period through the Mishnah time period and the beginning of the Gemara. And lo and behold, what did I see right when I got there? And I'll put up a picture in today's post on the website. It was really probably a bull with an animal, a pretend animal that they put up there drinking from the boar. And you could see in the background that there were breached walls behind it. Okay, I don't know if they were exactly Pasei Biraot, but it obviously made me think of the Gemara we were learning. And then interestingly enough, you'll see later, there was another thing I saw there, which I'll post the pictures also, that's gonna come up later in today's daf. So it's always fun when that happens. So now Abai is asking Rabba a number of questions regarding the situation of Pasei Biraot. Today we're going to get into all sorts of questions about it, which also relate to all sorts of things relating to how Pasei Biraot work. Is it a real solid mechitza? Is it not? Etc. So Abai asked Rabba the following question: Chatzer sheroshan nichnas leben hapasim. Okay, you can look at the picture. I came up with a better system for the pictures. I got permission from the portal at Daf Yomi, who has all the pictures online, to basically post a link to his site on our site. So I'm going to be posting every day on the post on Hadron's website, the link to the pictures. I'll also be sending it out on the Hadron WhatsApp groups, the Daf Yomi WhatsApp groups, where I send a link to every day's shiur. If you're not in that group and you want to be part of it, you can find a link to subscribe on Hadron's site on today's post. Okay, on every day's post, there's a link at the bottom that says you can, or somewhere on the page where it says you can subscribe to be part of a WhatsApp group, and then every day you'll get a link to the YouTube, to the page on Hadron's site with the today's post, and which has the summary and the podcast, and it also will have a link to the pictures, and I'll also put it up in the details of the podcast so that you can also access it. If you listen only to the podcast, you can access it from there. If you listen to YouTube, so you can just go also onto our site and get to it from there. Okay, so starting with picture number 131. Okay, here's picture number 131. You see a courtyard. Okay, we're going to talk about it in a second, and I'll show you again in the picture. Okay, Chatzir sheroshan nichnas leben hapasim. Okay, if the chatzir leads out into the courtyard, and it happens to be, leads out of the courtyard, and it goes into the public domain, but right outside, okay, what happens is there's Pasei Biraot up against the walls of the chatzir, but the walls of the chatzir jut out, and when you exit into the chatzir, you're exiting into this area of the Pasei Biraot. If you see, there's a white dotted line, that's when Reshut HaRabim starts. So we asked the following question. He says, if your Roshan Nichnas, the exit to the Chatzir, when you're getting out, the entrance or exit, is Roshan Nichnas leben hapasim, ma'u letaltel mitocha leben hapasim u'miben hapasim letocha. Can you carry from the Chatzir into this area ben hapasim, and from the area ben hapasim into the Chatzir? What's the issue? The issue is that ben hapasim really allows you to carry water from the well. That was the whole idea. Now, the issue is that it's not exactly a Reshut HaYachid. If it were, okay, there's a few things. Number one, if it's a Reshut HaYachid, we have a bit of a problem. You can't carry from one Reshut HaYachid to another Reshut HaYachid, not from rabbinic law. So you can't do that. On the other hand, this is an area that's not really exactly a Reshut HaYachid. It's an area that's allowed for public use. So if you're going out from your chatzir into this public use area, do we say this is actually an area for you also, and therefore we allow you to carry there? So what's the situation? He says, Amrle mutal. He says, no problem. So then Abai continues and he asks, Shtayim mai, what if two chatzerot lead out to there? Okay, for this we have the next picture. Picture number picture number 132. Okay, what if you have two courtyards that lead out to an area where there's a be'er in the middle, and there's the Pasei Biraot around it. Okay, you have those little posts around it with the well in the middle. So now he says, what about Shnai? Amarle asur. So Rabbah says this is forbidden. Amar Rav Huna explains why. Shtayim asurim va'afilu irvu. Even if the two chatzerot made an eruv together, in which case, theoretically, if the two of them are together, that allows them to carry from one to the other, which almost sounds like the two are like one, and one going out to there is allowed. So shouldn't that be allowed? But he says, Gzera shema yomru eruv mo'il leben pasim. What are we worried about? People won't necessarily know that those two people did an eruv together. Okay, if you look at the picture number 133, if you look carefully, what's the difference? This is like a good thing when you're little and you do those things. What's the difference between these two pictures? These pictures really look the same, except there's something in the back there. In between the two courtyards, there's an opening, which means they did an eruv and they opened the space between the two so that they could carry from one to the other. And he says, even in that case, where theoretically the two of them are really like one, and it should be allowed for them to carry, however, they made a gzera. What's the gzera? It means they said, you're not allowed to do this, even though theoretically by the law you can. Gzera shema yomru eruv mo'il leben pasim. You might think that an eruv works even to carry in this area ben pasim. What does that mean? If two chatzerot led into a mavoi, we could do what we call shitufei mavot, and all, remember, that's the whole thing of a mavoi. We allow everyone who belongs to this mavoi together to carry within this space. Why is that? Because the mavoi becomes private space for all those people, right? It's kind of the space that they all shared property. What's the problem? That only works, number one, if you have a mavoi with 3 walls. This pasei biraot does not have 3 walls. The walls are kind of fake and they're not exactly real walls. Number 2, the whole issue with the eruv is that we allow it because it turns all this space into space that's just for use of the people in the chatzerot. In this case, you want to allow people from the chatzerot to join together, and theoretically, let's assume these people didn't have an eruv with each other. They weren't really like one unit. In order to combine them, what do? We put a shitufei mavot, we put food together, and we close off the mavoi, right? We make some sort of a demarcation. That allows this space to be considered private for all the people in the chatzerot. That's very different from these pasim. The pasim are basically saying this area is for anyone and everyone to use. I would say everyone being the key word. And therefore, you can't allow people from a chatzer to make an eruv together with everyone that's entering this pasei biraot from, let's say someone's on the other side, right? Let's say they're not together and one chatzer is on one side and one is on the other, but there's this public space that's belonging to everybody in between. It's not like there's a mavoi, which is only for those people. So therefore, we're worried that they'll do that and they'll think an eruv works, bena pasim, even, right? An eruv would work to connect two people that aren't connected to each other. In this case, the chatzerot happen to be connected, but nobody knows, and people won't necessarily notice that they're connected, and they might come to misconstrue the law and think that it's okay. So now they say, Rava Amar Irvu Mutar. But Rava thinks, okay, so Rava said no, Rava says yes. And Rav Huna came to explain why Rava said no. And now Rava says Mutar. And Amar le'abai le'Rava, okay, basically Rava says if they made an eruv, then it's really no problem because they really are like one and one works. So therefore, multiple will work. So Amar le'abai le'Rava, Tanya t'b'sei halach. I'm going to bring a bride to prove. Chatzir sh'rosha achad nichnas leben hapasim, mutar l'taltel mitocha leben hapasim, u'miben hapasim l'tocha. Aval shtayim asur. So far, this sounds like what Rava said. A chatzir with one exit works, but if there's 2 chatzerot, it doesn't work. However, then it says, Bamed dvarim amurim in this brayta, in which case, shelo irvu. Only if they didn't do an eruv together. Aval irvu mutarim. But if they did an eruv, it works. So there you have support for Rava. So now let's just use this brayta against what Rav Huna said and say you must be wrong. So Amar Lacha Rav Huna could say, Hatam dehadran va'arvan. No, this must be a case where, and now there's 2 understandings of Rashi. I'll show you in the picture here on 134. They give one explanation, which is Hadar ve'irvan means they had a big breach in the back in between the 2 courtyards, okay? And therefore, the breach is all the way in the back, but it's very large. So all of a sudden, there was another breach. If there's another breach, then it becomes very clear to everybody, okay? Other people actually say, no, the breach is in the front, okay? You can see there's a picture in Rashi, right? There's a picture that shows this case. And if you see, here the breach is in the back, like we just showed. But some people explain Rashi as the breach is in the front. In other words, there was a breach near the front, and then it was obvious. That would be almost a better case, where it was obvious to everyone who looked in, who saw that there was this big breach, and that those two chatzerot, it was obvious they were together, and therefore no one would think that you could learn from here to two chatzerot that don't have an Eruv. Last question of Abaye Rabba. What if the water dries up on Shabbat? We talked about this before with the bore. Maybe the bore is different because it's likely it might dry up. So what happens if the water dries up on Shabbat? Isn't the whole purpose of the mechitza just to allow you to draw water? So as soon as there's no water, the mechitza is invalid, basically. So now they say, by Ravin asked, though, based on this, you have shumayim b'Shabbat, ubau b'Shabbat. What if the water dries up on Shabbat, and then it rains and more water comes on Shabbat? So there was a time period where it wasn't allowed, but then it became allowed. So he says, what's the situation? Amalei Abaye, yavshu b'Shabbat lo tibayla. The part about it drying up on Shabbat, you don't even need to ask. Debai minei dimal upasha le'daser, because I already asked Rabba, and he told me it was forbidden. But ba'unami lo tibaylach, and if the water comes back, also there's no reason to ask a question. The answer is obvious. Tahamet lemachitza asuya b'Shabbat. It's like a machitza that's created on Shabbat. And what do we learn about that? V'tanya kol machitza asuya b'Shabbat, bein b'shogeg, bein b'miziv, bein b'onis, bein b'ratzon, whether it was accidental, whether you intentionally built a wall, whether it was you were forced to build it, or whether you did it willingly. Either which way, shma mechitza. It functions as a mechitza. In other words, if you built a wall, even though you weren't allowed to necessarily build the wall, or you weren't allowed to because it's building, but it counts as a mechitza. In other words, the fact is now there's a mechitza. So obviously this would count. So now the Gemara responds, this is wait. V'lav itmar la, but wasn't it said about that braita? Amar Rav Nachman lo shanu ela lizrok, aval letaltel lo. That heter was only, or that, not heter, that definition, that we're going to call it a mechitza even if, remember, every time we talk about defining something as a Reshut Yachid, it has a leniency and a stringency. Leniency that we can carry inside. Stringency that if you bring something from the public domain into here, you're going to be obligated by Torah law. So now they're going to obviously say, when we said it counts as a mechitza, that's only lizrok. If you threw something in from the public domain to here, we're going to count it as a mechitza. We're going to be strict. But letaltel, but to allow carrying inside, no, they didn't allow that. So now they say no. Itmar de Rav Nachman, amazing Itmar. No, Rav Nachman, when he said lo shanu el lizrok aval letaltel lo, that's only when you intentionally built a wall. There's two cases. There's mezid and there's shogeg, or ones and ratzon. Right? There's intentional and you wanted to do it, or you were forced into it, or you didn't. Right? It happened accidentally. So now, if it's shogeg or ones, then we're going to say it even counts to allow carrying inside, which means that these pasebi ra'ot, where there was no water and then all of a sudden there was water, that would be allowed even to carry because it wasn't something you did intentionally. The rain came on its own. Likewise, or the opposite, we're going to say if you intentionally do it though, then we're going to penalize you, and then it doesn't even work to allow you. Then it works to call this a Reshut Yachid, that you a private domain, that if you threw something from the public domain, you'd be obligated by Torah law, but it doesn't allow you to carry inside because we're going to penalize you. Next halacha. Amar Rabbi Elazar, hazorek lebein pasei biraot chayav. If you throw something into this area that has these four cornered things, these jumadim, then we're going to say you're obligated, meaning you throw from the public. This is called the private domain. Now we know it's called the private domain because we already said we allow you to carry within it. On the other hand, the whole next discussion is going to be really, is this really a private domain? Is it a private domain in all ways? Because we already know it only works for water. It doesn't work for anything else. So it's a pseudo private domain. So the question is, how do we figure it out? So now, where do we put this? How do we categorize it? So he says, if you throw into pasebi ra'ot from the public domain, you're chayav, meaning by Torah law. Okay, this is by Torah law a Reshut Yachid. So the response to the Gemara is, pshita, isn't that obvious? If we don't call this a mechitza and we don't think it's a private domain, then how on earth could they allow anyone to fill up water from here? So they say, lo tzricha da'avi ke'ein pasebi ra'ot b'reshut harabim v'zarak l'tocha chayav. So they say, it must be you made something like pasebi ra'ot and reshut harabim. If you put up these four posts, Okay, but there wasn't a well in the middle. Would you be obligated if you threw into that from Reshut HaRabim? And it's coming to tell you, yes, you'd be obligated by Torah law. So now they say, Hanami Pshita, that's also obvious. So they say, Ilav de ba'alma mechitzahi, if we didn't call this a mechitza, gabe bol, heichim mishtarile letaltale. How would they allow us? In other words, again, either this is a mechitza or it's not a mechitza. If it's not a mechitza, then it shouldn't allow us to carry within. So now the Gemara says, Lo tzricha af al gav de kabake ba'arabim. The point is, let's say you put up these 4 posts, and still all your hordes of people that walk through Reshut HaRabim walk right through it, because really they don't block you. If you have real walls, it would block you and you go around. You wouldn't have a lot of people, and that's why it makes sense to call it a private domain. That's usually why we say something that's 4 by 4, right? You're going to walk around it. But here, we're going to say even if people walk through it, we're still going to call it a private domain. So now they say, Umay kamash malam, what are you trying to say then? If that's your whole reason for teaching us this, what are you trying to teach us? You're trying to say that the fact that many people walk through things doesn't cancel out the wall, a definition of something that has walls. But if that's what you want to teach us, well, that makes no sense, because Rabbi Elazar was the one who said this. And we want to say is, he's trying to say, even if there wasn't a well in the middle, if there's Pasei Birot in the middle of Reshut HaRabim. Now, what's the difference? If there's a well, people probably won't walk right through. They'll probably walk around because there's a well in the middle. If there's no well and you just have these posts, so people will probably walk around. But now they're going to say, no, they're telling you that even if, my mistake. I meant to say people probably won't walk around because there's nothing blocking them. It's just little posts. They'll walk right by the post. Remember, they're only 1 amma, 1 cubit, not very wide. There's a big space in between. People will walk right through it. And Rabbi Elazar is trying to teach you that doesn't cancel out those mechitzot. They're still called mechitzot. If you throw into that space, you're obligated for carrying from public to private. So now they say, wait, if you want to say that many people walking through doesn't cancel out mechitzot, Rabbi Elazar said that elsewhere. So Rabbi Elazar doesn't need to say that now because he already said it somewhere else. Where? Rabbi Elazar Chadazimne. He said it somewhere else. Ditna. It was the Mishnah. And his comment on the Mishnah was this halacha. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Imaita derech Reshut HaRabim mifas ketan, okay, if Reshut HaRabim went right in the middle of it, Yisalkena litzdadim, then you move it aside. In other words, if you want to make these pasei biraot and the public domain goes right through them, let's say you had a public domain that was very wide and then it narrows in a certain place and there's the be'er and there's your pasei biraot and this is where everybody walks through. So the Mishnah says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Yistalkena litzdadim, you put it to the side, right? You basically move the public, you make an area that people can go through. That means they don't have to go through this pasei biraot because we want to make this private. But what is Tana Chachamim Omrim? Einot tzarich, you don't need to. Even if a lot of people walk through, it's totally fine, even though theoretically we want to call this a public space. Now, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, the Amrei Travayu, they both said, Kan hodiacha kochan shel mechitzot. This is where we see the power of walls, that even if tons of people walk through, the walls turned it into a private domain. So if he said that over there, he doesn't need to say that here, okay? He already taught the halacha he wants to teach here. We already narrowed it and said, when he said the words, hazorek lebein pasei biraot chayav, if you throw into the space where the pasei biraot are, you're chayav, and we kept saying, isn't that obvious, isn't that obvious? And we kept giving answers. In the end, we concluded it must be, he means, even if many people walk through. But that he already said about that Mishnah. So it doesn't make any sense. This Mishnah we're going to come across in a few dapim. So now, I think it's on Kaf Bet. So now he says, if you just said it there, right? This is where the rabbis taught you how strong machitzot can be. You might have thought, maybe what they meant is the rabbis are trying to teach you how strong walls can be, but they don't hold that way. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar don't agree with it. That's why he said it here, to say, not only is this what they're saying, but I agree with it. So then why didn't he just make his comment by us, where he said, about the Pasei Biraot, and he didn't need to say it about that Mishnah because he already made his point clear here. So they say, really one was said from the other, meaning he really said it here about Pasei Biraot. Then his students, when it says there that Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, the Amrei Travayu, that both of them say, Kanod Yacha Kochan Shel Mechitzot, was his students commenting on what he said in our situation, and they learned from there and then said it about that Mishnah. So it wasn't that he actually said it twice. There really would be no reason for him to have said it twice. Okay, moving on. Mutar lakchiv lebe'er. How close can you get to the well? How close can you put your pasei biraot, these posts? Tanan hatam lo ya'amor adam bereshut harabim v'yesheh bereshut hayachid, bereshut hayachid v'yesheh bereshut harabim, elen ken machnis rosho v'rubo l'makom shu shoteh. So now they're quoting another Mishnah, which is later on in the Masechet, and it says, a person can't stand in the public domain and drink in a private domain. Okay, meaning your be'er is here, you're standing right next to the be'er, and you go down and you drink. Can't do that. Unless you put your head and the majority of your body, l'makom shu shoteh. You basically have to lean most of your body over the well in order to allow you to drink. V'chein begat. Okay, and also the same halacha applies in a gat. There's a big debate about what this is. I'll explain according to one interpretation. One says this has nothing to do with Shabbat. Okay, some people say it really does, and it means the same thing about a gat. If you're standing over a gat, okay, for this you can also look up today's posts. I'll put up pictures of a gat. That's where I saw yesterday. Also a gat. I got there. There was a huge. I've never seen this big gat. A gat is a wine press. There were 8 different areas that led all, okay, there were 3 levels of the gat, and on the first level, there were 8 different areas, as if imagine 8 different people standing there, treading on the grapes, okay, right, what's the word, trotting on them, or treading, anyway, they pressed the grapes. Then from those 8 areas, each of them had, it narrowed into a certain space, and from there, it dropped down to the second level. That second level, they would go, and then only when it got up to a certain level, it would spill over, right? Each level is meant to basically get rid of some of the dregs. So the part that leans down, right, that leads to the next level down is always a little bit higher than the floor, because if it was with the floor, all the bad stuff would come also. So then it leads into this square. You can look at the pictures, okay? There's a square in the middle that's raised a little bit, and it's empty in the middle, right? It's a square, and then there's space. Drips down into there. There's a gutter that comes out from the side of that whole space, drops down from there through the gutter. The gutter leads down to the 3rd level. And in the 3rd level, there's flat surface. It goes on that flat surface into this huge, and it was tremendous. You thought about the amount of wine that they must have been making in that wine press was huge. And it would fall into the pit, okay? There's a pit where all the wine would be. Now, if you're in the gat, which is the part where they were treading on the grapes, and you wanted to drink some of the wine that was collecting there, do you have to take Trumot Masrot? Now, the answer is that you don't have to take Trumot Masrot if you are eating what we call achilat arai, okay? If you're eating casually, you're not, right? And there hasn't really been Gemar Malacha. It's not finished yet, okay? So the question becomes, where in this wine press are you allowed to drink that it's still considered achilat arai and you don't have to take Trumot Masrot? So the assumption is if you drink, and whatever's left, you're going to drop right back in, then it's not so sanitary. You certainly wouldn't do that nowadays with Corona, but let's just assume you're drinking and you have extra. So that's only going to happen when you're leaning Rosho V'Rubo over the gat. But the assumption is if only your head is over the gat, but the rest of your body is not, then you're actually really, it's more like you're taking it outside the area, and then you will actually have to take Trumot Masrot. That's not going to be considered achilat arai. That's one interpretation of what this means. I'm going to suffice with that for now. So now they say, okay, now we're starting a new thing. So that was this, they started with this Mishnah that Adam can't stand Bereshut Rabim, v'yeshev Bereshut Yachid, or Bereshut Yachid, v'yeshev Bereshut Rabim. You can't be in 2 spaces unless Machnis Rosho V'Rubo to the space where he wants to drink from. So now the Gemara says, Gabe Adam, we're now going to have 2 versions of what this question is. The first version is like this. Gabe Adam, ha'amar debai Rosho V'Rubo. Okay, so it says, if you're a person, you need Rosho V'Rubo. Because what's the concern? The concern is, now we're back to carrying. The concern is that if you lean over to drink, let's say you're drinking with a cup, and you lean over to drink, you have a utensil in your hand, you might accidentally, if the majority of your body isn't there, you might, let's say, fill up a cup, and then instead of drinking from the cup right there, you might lean back and drink in the other reshut, and then you'll have moved your cup from one reshut to the other. So the fact that you need roshav rubo by adam, I understand. But if you want to allow your animal to eat, and now the assumption is you're giving your animal to drink, and now we're going to talk about two different possibilities. Either you're holding the animal and you're holding the utensil that he's going to drink from, or maybe you're just holding the utensil and not the animal. So they say, do you need rosho and rubo of the animal to be in that space or not? So now they say, if you're holding the kli, but you're not holding the animal, and you want the animal to drink, well then obviously lo tibailach, tibai roshav ruba miligyo. Of course you have to have roshav rubo in that space, because otherwise the animal will move his head out. As you know, animals move, they don't exactly do what you want. And then you'll end up moving your kli to follow the animal, and you'll easily move it from one domain to the other. And that will be forbidden. But the question is, let's say you're holding the utensil and you're holding the animal. Then the animal's not going to move because you're holding him in place. Maybe then you don't need rosho v'rubo to be inside. All you need is his head where he's drinking from. What's the case? So now they say, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Amar lei tanitua ubevad shetehei para roshav v'ruba mibifnim v'shota. What did we say? The para there has to be enough space to have the para be inside rosha and ruba, the head and the majority of the body. My lav, now, it obviously depends what the case is. So, my lav, first they're assuming it must be denakit lav and nakit mana. You're holding it and you're holding the kli, which means you're holding the animal and the kli, and you still need rosha verubo, which means you do. But then obviously the Gemara says, no, you don't have to assume that's the case. Lo, denakit mana v'lo nakit la. You could say the case is he's holding the kli and he's not holding the animal, and that's why you need the animal to be the majority of its body inside, which we already said was obvious in that case. So now they say, wait, according to what you're saying, ki nakit mana v'lo nakit la. Our assumption was if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, that you're going to need rosho verubo. But rosho verubo inside is sufficient, right? That's obvious. So now they say, mishare, if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, we said, right, if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, we assumed you need rosho verubo, right? The whole question was, do we need it in the other case if you're holding the animal? But now, is rosho verubo going to be sufficient? The Hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita, lo yimalei adam mayim v'yitem b'shabbat lifnei behemto. You can't fill up water and put that bucket of water in front of the animal. The only thing you can do is, aval memalehu v'shofech. You can fill it up, pour it into a trough or something like that where the animal's eating from, or some kind of area where the animal, it wouldn't be a trough. A trough is really for food. But it would be an area that the animal's eating from. You pour it in front of the animal. But you actually can't be holding a utensil by the animal. So it sounds like even if rosho verubo is there, you still can't be holding the utensil. So why do we assume if you're holding the utensil and not the animal, that rosho verubo will work? So now the Gemara says, no, don't worry about that source, that Braita. Ha'itmar la, was said about that source, Amar Abaye, okay, for this you need the picture. If you see, there's a picture in Rashi here. There was a whole bunch of things written about that picture, but I'm going to leave it right now. So if you look at picture number 135, what do you have? Okay, this is a much better picture than Rashi. Rashi doesn't have a color picture nor a big picture. But if you look at this picture, what do you have? You have evus ha'omei bereshut harabim. You have an evus that is standing, a trough. Okay, this trough is in the public domain. Here's the para in his private domain. Okay, and the refet, let's say, in his barn. There's the animal. Now, what happens in this case? It says it's gavoa asarat tvachim v'rochav arba. That means that evus, that trough, is 4 by 4 width and 10 height. So it itself becomes a reshut hayachid, private domain. Now, what happens next? Rosho echad nichnas lebein hapasim. What's the issue? Where the trough ends is already between pasim. You see those pasim there, and there's a be'er. Now the owner is standing here. He gets he's right next to the well. He fills up water from the well, and he wants to place it in where the trough is and give it to his animal to drink. Now the question is, can he take it from, this is Rashid, right, notice, the space right outside where the animal is in the barn is Rishut Harabim. But a little bit further at the tip of the trough, at the end of it, it's already in Rishut Yachid, in between these Pasei Biraot. So it's a very weird situation because you have Rishut Yachid where the animal is, then you have a Rishut Harabim space, but connected, right, you have the Evus, the trough, which is juts into the space between the Pasei Biraot, which is allowed. So the owner is standing in between those Pasei Biraot to get the water, pours it, he puts the dli, the bucket, into the feeding trough. So that's what Abaye says this case was in the Braita. When the Braita said, Lo yimaleh adam mayim v'yitem b'shabbat lefnei behemto, meaning he can't put the deli right in front of the animal. But what can he do? Mimaleu v'shofech, I'm just going backwards for a minute to read the source that we're now reinterpreting. Mimaleu v'shofech v'shotame eleha. You fill it up, he pours into it, he can pour into the feeding trough, and he shotame eleha, and then the animal can drink from it. Now, so Abaye said, this is be'evus halmei b'reshut rabim, gavoa asarat tvachim, rochav arba'a, right? It becomes its own reshut yachid. V'rosho echad nichnas lebein pasim, right? And the head of it is jutting out. Now, why is this going to be potentially a problem, that he can't actually put the deli in front of the animal? Theoretically, he could because he's in a private domain, but because he's in between the Pasei Biraot, and the trough is a private domain, so it should be allowed. What do we say? When he brings the water to the trough, what if he sees something's ruined in the evos? Meaning, let's say there's a hole, and if he pours the water, it's all going to spill out, or he brings it, right? He'll start getting closer. Now remember, part of the trough is already in the public domain because there's the Pasei Biraot are not up against the wall of the barn on the outside. No, they're further out into the public domain. So if we allow him to bring his deli all the way to the animal, he might accidentally see something broken. And what will he do? He'll go to fix it. And he'll keep the bucket in his hand and he'll keep walking. He'll walk right into that public domain that's right in between the private space. So because of that, the Rishut Harabim were worried he's going to go from private to public. That will be a problem. Right? That's all just to show you in the picture. We're worried about him walking into this space. Okay, in between the two Rishuyot. So if he goes to here, the tip of the Evus, and then, right, where here he's allowed because there's a line here from the Pasei Biraot. But then he sees something's broken, he's going to walk further, and then he'll carry over here in this space, right, and he'll end up being in public domain. So now they say, wait a minute. This is not really a problem. This goes back to the beginning of Masechet Shabbat. If you're moving stuff from one corner to another, you're bringing them in your house, and then all of a sudden you change your mind, and you bring them outside, patur. Why? Remember, you need an akira, an uprooting, and a hanacha, a placing. When you uprooted it and you started carrying it, you weren't planning to take it outside. Your uprooting was to uproot in order to carry it within your house. Then you decide to take it outside. Well, that's only half an act because you only did hotza'an, really hanacha. You placed it down when you got to public, but you didn't actually uproot it with the intent to carry it outside to the public domain. You're not obligated. Likewise, when he picked up the water, he intended to bring it just to the trough, which was allowed. So the fact that later he might put it in the wrong space, that shouldn't be forbidden. So, Ella, what do we say? No. What are we worried about? He'll go to fix the trough. Now, when he moves to the other side of the trough, the assumption is the side where the cow is, that's where the problem is. So when he moves into that space where the public domain is, he'll put the bucket down. Then he's going to go back carrying the bucket in his hand. Maybe he wants to fill up more water, and he'll forget that he's in a public space right now. That time, when he picks it up now and moves it, he's going to be moving from public to private. It's that act that we're concerned with. Okay, so that's the problematic issue. That was all the question. Let me just remind you, we started off with Adam needs to be Rosh Verubo anywhere he wants to drink. Then we moved to what about an animal? And we said, obviously, if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, you will need Rosh Verubo. The whole question was, what if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal. You're holding the kli and the animal. Do you need rosho verubo? Okay, so that was what we said. One second. If you're holding the animal, then do you need it or not? Okay, and then they said, just one second, right? And then they tried to learn it from our Mishnah, and then it wasn't so clear that we learned it from our Mishnah because it's not clear which case our Mishnah is, and we really end up with no resolution. And then we kind of went back and questioned the first assumption, which is if you're holding, we questioned if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, right? Where we said for sure you need rosho verubo. Is it even, can you even use rosho verubo? Is this even allowed at all? Because aren't we worried? Look at that other Mishnah. And then we said, no. We're not worried about that because that Mishnah was talking about a unique case with this trough and that we're worried you're going to end up accidentally carrying it, but that's not our case. So now we're going to have a different version of this whole question. Ikada Amri. Some people say, Gabe Adam hakamrinan desagele berosha verubo. Now we're going to see not that he needs rosha verubo, but that rosha verubo is sufficient. Okay, we're going to say it works for an Adam as long as you have rosha verubo. We're now coming from the other direction. Yes, it does work. Okay, now the question is, it's sufficient. Sagim is the important word here. It's enough to have rosha verubo. That works. Gabe para misagela berosha verubo alo. But does that work for a para or not? Maybe it doesn't work. So now they say, wait, which is the question? This is going to be the reverse, is what we saw before. Hey, because we're coming from the other direction, right? There was, do you need rosha verubo? Here it's, is rosha verubo sufficient, or maybe it's not even going to be enough. So if you're holding the animal and you're holding the kli, the utensil, lo tibailach, that you don't even need to ask, just sagele rosha verubo. Now that was the whole question of the first one. Now they're saying, right, the question was, do you need rosha verubo? They're saying now, obviously rosha verubo is enough. In the other case, we wanted to say, maybe you don't even need rosha verubo. But that's not what they're saying here. Obviously that works. What if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal? Does that even work? So Amarle, Tani Tua, let's learn it from our Mishnah. So what do you see? It is enough. And now you have to obviously say, what's the case? It's only going to work if that were the same scenario. So now they're going to assume the opposite of what they assumed last time. Isn't the Mishnah talking about where you're holding the utensil, but you're not holding the animal? And what do you see? Rosha verubo works. So now they say, no, that's not the case. You're holding the utensil and you're holding the animal. And I can even further prove that. And now we go back to what we said before. If you were holding the kli and you weren't holding the animal, who says it would be allowed? You can't hold a bucket in front of your animal. You can only pour it in and let the animal drink. So what do you see? You can't. So therefore it makes sense that source wasn't talking about where you're holding the kli, where you're holding the kli and not the animal. It must be you're holding the kli. 1 second, right? If you're not holding the animal at all, then obviously you can't give him water because that was what that Braita said. So it must be, our mission was you're holding the kli and you're holding the animal, and then rosha verubo would work. Okay? So now they say, that if you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, then, right, 1 second, right? The question is, if you're holding the kli and not the animal, right? So then what would be the case? And then we basically, right? So then this shows you, we're assuming that if you're holding the kli and not the animal, you can't even do rosha verubo. None of that works. And that's what we prove for this Braita. But then they say, no, because that Braita wasn't talking about this case. That Braita was concerned for a different thing. And we already said this. It's exactly the case that we saw where the animal is in the feeding from his own Rishut Yachid. The owner is in Rishut Rabim, but he's between these Pasei B'Ra'ot, and he wants to give the food there, which theoretically you can't put the water down, but right, you can give him the deli, but the halacha is you can't, because we're worried if he's carrying the bucket and goes to give the animal, what might happen? Let's see something's broken with the trough, and he'll want to fix it, and then he'll end up carrying the pail into the public domain. Again, the Gemara says, wait, are are we obligating in this case? If you were going to carry things in your house and you pick them up with the intent to carry them in your house, which was allowed, and then you just changed your mind and took them out, you're not obligated because your akira, your uprooting of it, didn't happen in a way that you meant to bring it outside, and all you have is putting it down in the public. That doesn't obligate you. So now, again, what might happen? You'll take the pail with you, and then when you go to fix it, you'll put the pail down. You'll put it down in Reshut Rabim. You're not obligated for that because you didn't lift it from Reshut Yachid to take it with the intent to put it in Reshut Rabim. But when you take it from the public domain and you bring it back now, you might accidentally bring it back and forget that you're in a public space, and you bring it back into between the Pasei B'Ra'ot, and then you'll be obligated. Okay, so just to review, and you can see this, I charted, it's organized on the sheet if that helps you. The first version of the question was, yes, we know it's true for Adam that he needs Rosh Haverubo. The question is, do you need it by an animal? And then the question became, in the case where, right, the question is, in the case where you're holding the kli and you're not holding the animal, does Rosh Haverubo, right, do you need Rosh Haverubo to be in? I'm sorry, you're holding the kli and you're holding the animal. Do you still need Rosh Haverubo, or is it enough just that his head is inside? That was the first version of the question, which in the end, we don't really answer. The second version was, by Adam, we know that it's sufficient to have Rosh Haverubo. It allows him to drink. By an animal, maybe it doesn't allow him to drink Rosh Haverubo. And then it would have to be the case where you're holding the kli, but you're not holding the animal. And maybe Rosh Haverubo doesn't help because animals move a lot. And maybe, right, they won't be able to. And in the end, again, we have an answer. We reject the answer. We prove the rejection of the answer. And then we actually say, maybe that's not true. But then we kind of say, oh, it is true. And we basically don't really have an answer again. Okay, now they're going to say Tashma. Now we're going back to question number one. Okay, question number one again was, by Adam, Rosh Haverubo works. By an animal, you need Rosh Haverubo. By an animal, do you need Rosh Haverubo? In a case where you're holding a kli, but you're not, and you're holding the animal, do you still need Rosh Haverubo? Or maybe you don't because you're holding him and obviously he's not going to move. So Tashma, let's learn from the following source. Gamal shirosho v'rubo mibifnim. You have a camel. His head and most of his body is inside. Ofsino to mibifnim. Okay, you basically can feed him. You can, now, ofsin in this case means force feed. You can force feed him from inside. Okay, he's in Reshut Yachid. You can force feed him inside Reshut Yachid. Now, what do they say? Ha'evus kimandid nakit mana v'nakit la damya. It's like the case of, now what's the case? He's standing outside and his Rosh Haverubo is inside and you're also inside. And it works, even though, right, Rosh Haverubo works. Now, what do you see here? Force feeding, isn't that like nakit mana v'nakit la? You're holding the animal and you're holding, and yet what do you see here? It needs Rosh Haverubo. So it sounds like you do need Rosh Haverubo in order to allow it. Kabi'inam Rosh Haveruba. As Amarav Acha Barav Huna Amarav Sheshet Shane Gamal Ho'il V'Tzavaro. Notice the case, it was a camel. Camel has a very long neck, which means even if you're holding it, doesn't mean his neck can't get out. And that's why he needs Rosh Haveruba, but maybe another animal wouldn't need Rosh Haveruba. So then they try another source, Tashma. Notice that this is basically the exact same source, except instead of Gamal, camel, it says Behema. It sounds like any animal. So there we said it was only a camel. Now we could say it's any animal. Again, it's the exact same case. You can force feed it as long as Rosh Haverubo, it says Rosh Haverubo allows you. And it's like you're holding the kli and you're holding the animal because you're force feeding it. The only way to do that is by holding the animal. And you need the majority. So now they say, my behema nami dekatane gamal. You can say, oh, it's also a camel. It just said animal. It meant camel. So the Gemara says, Vahatanya behema, Vahatanya kamal. But one source said behema. One source said camel. So when it says behema, it must have really meant behema, not camel. So now they say, no, that's not a good proof. Tanya, what do you mean? Brightot were said in different places. Different people said different brightot. It's not like they put all these brightot, they wrote them all at the same time, and therefore you could say it's consistent. If this says behema and that says gamal, it must mean that's behema, that's gamal. No. Okay, no, really, it could be this one called it a behema and that one called it a camel. It really means camel. Tanya Namihachin. In fact, there's a brighter to support our answer, which is Rabbi Elazar Oser Begamal, Ho'il v'tzavaro aroch. He forbids it. Actually, maybe it's Rabbi Eliezer. Anyway, he forbids it in a gamal because his neck is long. And there you see that it's specifically, it's Rabbi Elazar. Okay, Rabbi Elazar forbids in a gamal because his neck is long. So there you see it's specifically a camel and not anyone else, in which case, again, this does not provide us with a proof. Okay, we'll stop here for today and pick up from here on Sunday's Daf. Okay, Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov.